Since 2006, about 60,000 Africans have arrived in Israel on harrowing treks through the Sinai Desert, fleeing poverty, persecution, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. As refugee camps across Africa fill up and Europe closes its gates to asylum seekers, Israel became the next best option, accessible by land and said to be a developed democracy. But instead of providing them with safe haven, Israel is both refusing to grant them any benefits and denying them the ability to work legally to support themselves. Faced with poverty and exploitation, a new nightmare unfolded.
עדיין לא מאוחר, אפשר מחר לעשות מעשה, להתחיל לאסוף את המסתננים, לא צריך לחכות לבג"ץ, לא צריך שום דבר.
אני רואה חיה מחוץ לבית שלי, יריקות, פסיכופטים, אנשים שרק מחפשים איך לרצוח אותי בעיניים שלהם, אבל אף אחד לא מאמין לנו. אנחנו גזענים כדי לרצות לשמור על החיים שלנו ועל השפיות שלנו. אז אני גאה בלהיות גזענית! אני גאה בלהיות גזענית! אם אני גזענית בשביל לשמור על החיים שלי, אז אני גאה!
While protests raged in the streets against the presence of asylum seekers from Africa, the man who held the power to determine their fate, Deputy Prime Minister Eli Yishai, demanded their expulsion.
אם ייתנו לי את כל הכלים, ואני פועל להשיג את כל הכלים, וזה לא קל. אם ייתנו לי את כל הכלים בלי יוצא מן הכלל, תוך פחות משנה לא יישאר בארץ ישראל אפילו מסתנן אחד.
And the few isolated Israelis who dared to protest, like this woman, were met with a harsh backlash. At the anti-African rallies we documented, one figure was ubiquitous, a member of Knesset named Michael Ben Ari. In August 2010, we interviewed him at his Knesset office.
יש להם שם בית. מה זה גירוש? איזה גירוש? הם שווים הביתה. כל מדינה בעולם מתוקנת הייתה עושה את זה. נהפוך להיות מדינת הגירה, אבל יש כאלה שעוינים את המדינה. ולכן הם רוצים להפוך אותה למדינת אזרחי כל העולם. נביא לפה 1,000,000 אפריקאים, 500,000 פיליפינים, 2-3 מיליון סינים, ושלום על ישראל.
למה זה מאיים שיהיו פה 1,000,000 אפריקאים?
זה מאיים כי לא תהיה פה מדינה יהודית. המדינה שלנו, תקשיב, המדינה שלנו שונה ממדינות אחרות. המדינה שלנו היא מדינה יהודית ודמוקרטית. זה איזון מאוד מאוד לא פשוט, זה יכול להיות תרתי סתרי במקומות מסוימים. זאת אומרת, דברים סותרים זה את זה במקומות מסוימים. במידה ותביא לפה 1,000,000 אפריקאים, תחדל מלהיות יהודית. אנחנו נלחמים, לדוגמה, בתופעה של התבוללות. בעולם ישנה התבוללות של 70-80% במקומות מסוימים בעולם. זאת אומרת, עם ישראל הולך לאיבוד. לי, עם ישראל יקר.
Ben Ari is known for leading nationalist marches through Arab neighborhoods inside Israel, where he antagonizes, intimidates, and menaces Arab citizens. On the holiday of Chanukah, Ben Ari led a rally at Levinsky Park, a public space in South Tel Aviv that has become home to many Africans who were denied work permits and the ability to afford housing.
אנחנו נגיד פה לכל הצבועים האלה, אתם רוצים לעזור לאפריקאים, תיסעו לאפריקה. אתם רוצים לתת להם אוכל, לכו תיתנו להם שם. זאת המדינה היהודית היחידה שיש לנו.
Earlier in the year, at an anti-African rally in Tel Aviv that was attended by thousands, Ben Ari was joined by lawmakers from the governing Likud party and other mainstream politicians.
אריתריאה וסודאן זה לא כאן. כאן זה הבית שלנו, כאן זו המדינה שלנו. אבל הדבר החשוב ביותר זה לגרש את המסתננים לארץ ישראל ולשמור על מדינת ישראל ומדינה יהודית.
חברים, אני היום במליאה אמרתי, הסודנים הם סרטן בגוף שלנו.
Minutes after the rally, 1,000 Israelis rioted, attacking African homes and businesses and assaulting any African they found in the street. Here is footage shot by one of the participants in the riot, a supporter of Michael Ben-Ari. Days later, Yulia Shmuelov-Belkovich, at the time a legislator from the centrist opposition party Kadima, called for Israelis who advocate for the Africans to be locked in prison camps alongside the asylum seekers.
דרך אגב, מעבירה אותם גם לאותו מקום שאנחנו בונים עכשיו את המחנות, שיעבדו שם.
According to the Israeli Coalition Against Racism, incidents of racist incitement by Israeli public figures doubled in 2012. In many cases, the targets of their hateful invective were not Palestinians, but African migrants. Chief among those targeting the presence of Africans in Israel is a corps of hundreds of state-appointed rabbis, including some of the premier religious authorities in Israel, who issued a letter forbidding Jews from renting apartments to the African asylum seekers and any other non-Jews. Here is a rabbi that we filmed, one of many who labored to promote the religious edict.
זה מהלך שניסינו פה להוביל בעיר, לא להזכיר להם בתים, לחץ כזה או לאחר שדיברנו עם בני הקהילה שלנו והסתובבנו, לנסות להקשות עליהם.
Though painted as an existential threat, the fact remains that Africans in Israel pose no known security threat to the country. None of them have engaged in acts of terrorism against Israel, and very few, if any, hold anti-Israel opinions. Most are eager to contribute to the prosperity and well-being of the country. So why are they being demonized, and why is the government so determined to deport them? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu previously warned that if the level of Arab citizens of Israel exceeds 30% of the general population, Israel could become a binational state and would lose its Jewish character. With tens of thousands of non-Jewish African migrants living in Israel by 2010, Prime Minister Netanyahu warned that their presence increases the looming threat to the Jewish character of the state.
אנחנו הצלחנו לבלום את הכניסה של המסתננים מאפריקה לישראל, אחרי שהיינו באיום של כניסה של מאות אלפים. החודש לא נכנס מסתנן אחד לערי ישראל, זה כבר כמה חודשים שאנחנו משיגים את התוצאה הזאת. בחודש הקרוב אנחנו נשלים את בניית הגדר לאורך גבול סיני, ועכשיו אנחנו עוברים לשלב השני, וזה השלב של החזרת המסתננים שכבר נמצאים כאן.
Already, the Israeli Knesset has amended the Anti-Infiltration Act it passed in 1954 to prevent Palestinian refugees from returning to their property. Under the new version of the law, non-Jewish migrants can be arrested on site and held in prison without trial for 3 years or more before being deported. To hold the migrants and asylum seekers before deporting them, Israel's government has built what it calls an accommodation center in the Negev desert. Blueprints of the center reveal that it will be in fact the largest prison of its kind in any industrialized nation. Currently, about 2,000 Africans languish in the detention center in what human rights groups describe as substandard conditions. This footage we shot outside the prison shows how vast it is. A comprehensive look at the interior of the prison camp has never been presented to the general public. Until the Israeli government is able to resolve the crisis, the chaos in the streets continues. This past New Year's Eve, we followed a mob of ultra-nationalists as they marched through South Tel Aviv, demanding the expulsion of non-Jewish Africans. After the march, the ultra-nationalists gathered at the headquarters of Michael Ben-Ari's Strong Israel Party, and that's when we were recognized as left-wing journalists.
חושב שעכשיו את האמת כבר נגמר לה. למה אתה עומד פה פוסטרמה? עם פרצוף של דביל? בטח שהוא...
I'm going to get into the situation of Africans in Israel, deeper into the talk, but just to tell you a little bit about that video which I shot with David Sheen, who's an independent journalist in Israel who's done more work on the issue of African non-Jewish asylum seekers in Israel than any other journalist alive. I don't think that's an exaggeration. First of all, Sheen is now embarking on a book project of his own about the situation to expose it and spread the word, and he has an Indiegogo campaign online, so I just encourage all of you to support him and to support exposing this issue, which has been whitewashed in our media. It really has been. This video was initially solicited from me by the New York Times OpDoc section, which is a online documentary section on the website of the New York Times, and they specifically asked for a submission about the plight of Africans in Israel. Of course, when they saw this, I don't know, they seemed apparently overwhelmed. I don't actually know why they rejected it, but they rejected it without explanation. So I gave it to the Nation. They were brave enough to put it on the website, and it's now, there are 2 copies online. One is at close to 500,000 views, and the other is well over 300,000 views. So there's clearly a lot of hunger for this kind of information from a public. Most of our hits are coming from the U.S., from a public that's been, you know, suffering under a cordon of silence about what's happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine. That's really why I decided to write this book, to loosen the blockade on information. You know, I believe in open sources, and I believe in telling people the truth without sanitizing it or whitewashing or without the typical bromides. I've been attacked, as you heard, from within the Nation, from Eric Alterman, who's a self-identified liberal Zionist. And he said that my book is technically factually accurate. So I'm going to have to change. That's my new nickname, is Technically Factually Accurate Blumenthal, or you can just call me TFA for short. And then he went on in a subsequent attack on me to say that it's technically factually accurate, but facts are not truth. So I love when liberals paraphrase and, you know, quote Reagan. It's my favorite thing. So this has been really exciting to watch. People like him have to grapple with things that they acknowledge are factual, but demand context that makes them feel better. I'm not going to be providing any of that sort of context tonight. I am going to be providing context that explains what's happening here. And what's happening here in this video is something that Palestinians have dealt with as well, which is that Israel has no criteria for Israeli citizenship. In other words, the Supreme Court of Israel 3 weeks ago just struck down an appeal from a group of liberal Israelis demanding that they establish Israeli citizenship. And they struck it down because citizenship in Israel is based on an ethnic criteria. It is an ethnocracy. So your citizenship is defined according to whether you're Jewish or Arab or whatever, non-Jewish. Everything flows from there. The current crisis is a result of this system. It's not the result of the occupation. The occupation represents a progression of the natural, it represents the natural progression of an ethnocratic structure as it moves into its terminal phase, especially according to settler colonial design. So what I'm looking at here is the real historical roots of the crisis. I don't see it as much as of a conflict as a crisis and even a conquest. And the phase that we're at right now is really the phase in which the peace process and the Oslo Accords have been extinguished. The Israeli government and its military intelligence apparatus sort of recognized this with the Second Intifada and began implementing what it calls hafrada, which means separation. Very similar to the Afrikaans phrase, apartheid, which means separateness, but applied much differently and I think in a much more sophisticated manner. The clearest manifestation of hafrada is the separation wall, which is 600 kilometers long and cuts deep into the West Bank, usurping over 180,000 dunams of Palestinian farmland. And this was designed not for security reasons, but for demographic reasons, in the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, to prevent demographic spillover. Netanyahu, as was stated in this documentary, fears and this is, on advice that he's received from state planners and demographers, that if Israel controls a territory where over 30% of the population is non-Jewish, it will lose its Jewish character and become a binational state. So currently, actually, Israel controls a territory in which the majority of people, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics of Israel, are not Jewish. They're Palestinian. They have to find a way of either relieving themselves of this population through some kind of two-state solution, or they officially move into the open with a system of apartheid. And increasingly, young Israelis and politicians in Netanyahu's party and the Likud party, which is dominant, and there's really no clear alternative to Likud right now, according to the latest polling, have no interest in establishing any form of Palestinian state, even a Bantustan state, a half Palestinian state. They clearly want to accept the consequences of open apartheid, if that's what it means to hold on to the West Bank and keep Gaza under siege forever. This has led to really a surge in racist attitudes that really I expose, and that's what I expose in my book, authoritarian attitudes and racist attitudes, particularly among the young, at what could potentially be a terminal phase of this society. My book starts actually in 2009. That's really where I enter the picture. It starts the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, the attack on the Gaza Strip, in which Israeli forces killed over 1,400 residents of the Gaza Strip, mostly civilians, according to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, including, I think, 313 children, mostly killed at home. There was 95% support among the Jewish Israeli public in the first week of this attack. In fact, the most left-wing Zionist party in Israel, the Meretz party, endorsed the attack. The attack was directed by the head of the Labor Party, Ehud Barak, and Tzipi Livni, who you'll see in whenever the peace process is covered. She is the chief negotiator of the Israeli government. You'll see her photograph with John Kerry, declared that our troops behaved like hooligans, which I demanded of them. She said that in the context of an election campaign as she was running for prime minister, as one politician after another tried to outcompete each other for the most bellicose and draconian statements they could conjure towards the Palestinians, because these attitudes were increasingly popular. And then there was a party that emerged, possibly was going to seize the prime minister's office, to the great horror of Washington, Yisrael Beitenu, the party of Avigdor Lieberman. And it was campaigning on a very simple slogan: no loyalty, no citizenship. In other words, if the Palestinian citizens of Israel comprise about 20% of the state's population, fail to basically become Zionists, we'll strip them of their citizenship rights. If they don't want to be in the army, if they don't want to do national service, if they want to observe their own tragedy publicly, they will be stripped of their rights. And this was so popular that Yisrael Beitenu swept high school mock elections at a time when most Jewish Israeli high school students had declared, a strong majority, that they would refuse to sit in a classroom with an Arab citizen of Israel. So I arrive at this time. I was fascinated actually by the changes that were happening in Israeli society. I wasn't just focused on what the misery that this attack had caused on the Gaza Strip. I was fascinated when I watched Israelis sit on Parash Hill, which journalists had called the Hill of Shame, because they were forced to sit there, banned from the Gaza Strip during the attack. And they cheered on the attack as Americans did at Bull Run, as Americans did at the Battle of Manassas, as though it were a picnic. This was really the full extent of their interaction with Palestinians during the era of Hafradah, or unilateral separation. And one woman was filmed by a Danish TV crew declaring they should wipe the whole thing off the map. Yeah, I'm a little bit fascist. And these were attitudes that I heard day in and day out as I immersed myself in Israeli society and its key institutions. But the first institution I had contact with in Israel when I arrived was the Ben Gurion International Airport, which is a fascinating place to be if you want to study Israeli security, not just Israeli security techniques, but the entire logic of the state. And I contrasted my own experience at this airport with the experiences of others like Dana Shalala, who's the Clinton administration's former Health and Human Services Secretary, who happens to be of Lebanese descent. She was on her way into Israel as the president of the University of Miami, on her way to a conference of university presidents to discuss how they can fight the how they can battle Palestine solidarity activism on campus. And she was subjected to hours of humiliating interrogations at the airport because of her Arab last name, which was sort of poetic justice. Then there was Annalise Miller, who's a journalistic colleague of mine. I encountered her actually in the West Bank. She had gotten a visa after passing through the airport that confined her to the West Bank, or what the Israeli government calls Judea and Samaria. Basically, she wasn't allowed to enter Israel proper. It limited her to 2 weeks. She returned again to go to a conference, which was sort of a propaganda conference for journalists who wanted, and it was organized to help promote pro-Israel opinions among journalists, and she thought this might allow her to gain entry in a 3-month visa like the kind I got. She was held at the border, at the airport, strip searched, and sent home, deported and banned for 10 years with no basis at all, except that she is of Lebanese descent. She's Lebanese American. She actually writes for Peter Beinart's Open Zion website, and I question why he never said anything publicly about one of his writers being treated this way. I get a much different treatment there. I'm Jewish, and when I enter, I'm asked if I'm Jewish, and then I'm asked if my parents were Jewish, and then I'm asked if my grandparents were Jewish, and so I check all the boxes, you know? And then I'm asked what Hebrew school I went to, and then I'm asked who my rabbi was, then I'm asked which holidays I celebrate, and I'm not in the army of God, I'm more like in the Secret Service, so I just do the 2 big holidays every year, and that's good enough for them, and then I'm pretty much waved through. I write about how I kind of fabricated an Israeli girlfriend, and a security officer asked me, are you thinking about getting married? And I said, I sure am, with a big smile, and she waved me through an additional security check because the possibility of me injecting the ovum of a Jewish Israeli woman with my Jewish sperm presented a possibility to establish further demographic edge over the Palestinians. So thanks to my J-positive blood, I was able to either get a 1 or a 2 designation, whereas some of my friends got 5 and 6 designation, which marks them for extended interrogation and deportation. You are given a number between 1 to 6, pretty much based on your ethnicity, but also your political profile. There is a blacklist of people who have politically dissident opinions, and that's why Noam Chomsky, the dangerous, violent octogenarian, was sent away at the Israeli-controlled frontier of Jordan. It's why Norman Finkelstein, this terrorist operative, was deported and sent away for 10 years because of their politics. This is democratic Israel. And Barbara Boxer, the progressive senator from California, is introducing legislation written by AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby, that will legitimize this, providing preferential visa treatment to Israeli citizens inside the United States without demanding reciprocity from the state of Israel, which deports over 100 Arab Americans every year on the basis almost entirely of their ethnicity. These are our fellow citizens, my fellow citizens, people I hang out with in Ramallah, go out drinking with, and everything's fine until I realize that they can't go to the same places I can go to. They may be just as talented or more talented than I am as a journalist, but I realize this when they ask if I can help sneak them through the wall so they can go visit parts of Tel Aviv or Haifa or just simply go to the beach. And so I came to see this book, Goliath, and all the facts I was able to present in it, from the river to the sea, as really the product of my Jewish privilege in a place controlled entirely by the state of Israel and its ethnocratic imperatives. And I don't take that lightly. I wanted to show people what they were paying for in the United States, particularly in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. I immersed myself in the Knesset, interviewed as many legislators as I could, particularly the legislators who were driving an agenda that could easily be described as anti-democratic. You saw my interview with Michael Ben-Ari, who is a former lieutenant of Meir Kahane. Meir Kahane was banned from the Israeli Knesset in 1988 for racist incitement. His party and its affiliated Jewish Defense League wing, Kach, is identified by the FBI as a terrorist group. And Michael Ben-Ari is back in the Knesset with several members of Kach. But Ben-Ari is unable to pass any legislation. And it's not because people reject his agenda. It's because his entire agenda and Kahane's agenda has been co-opted by mainstream parties, including to some degree by members or former members of the Labour Party, like Ehud Barak, who supported Benjamin Netanyahu's introduction of an amendment to the Israeli citizenship law mandating oaths of loyalty to the Jewish and democratic state for new citizens. This was something first introduced by Kahana, loyalty oaths. And the idea of loyalty oaths has dark resonances in European history. This passed. This is a new requirement. The acceptance to communities law, I interviewed its authors. One of its authors was a former member of Peace Now, and he simply wanted to allow kibbutzim and small communities to officially discriminate on the basis of religion, race, and even sexuality. Whatever the basis was, their criteria was, this law would have legitimized it. The real reason this law was introduced was because in the 90s, the Israeli Supreme Court authorized, and there was a huge controversy, a huge debate over this, one Arab family, the Qadan family, to move into a mitzpeh community. Mitzpeh means like watchtower, and these are small communities built around Palestinian Israeli towns, mostly in the northern Galilee region, to obstruct their natural growth and basically keep an eye on them. And they had been Jewish only until this point when a Palestinian Israeli family purchased a lot, and all of a sudden the community, through its welcoming committee, all these communities keep Palestinians out through acceptance committees, said, no, you can't, and it went to court. And Barak said that this was the hardest ruling he's ever had to make. This was the man that Elena Kagan cited as her judicial inspiration when she testified in her confirmation hearing. And he said it was the hardest ruling he ever had to make, but they eventually allowed this family to live there, this single family. And so this law was passed to make sure that not one more family could do that. The Jewish and/or democratic law was introduced in the last Knesset, and it's been reintroduced by Naftali Bennett, who's the economics minister, the head of the third largest party in Israel right now, the Jewish Home Party, which is basically a religious settler party. Although Bennett lives inside Israel and is affluent, sort of a product of the high-tech economy, speaks good English. He's anything but frightening, at least in terms of how he presents himself. But he has declared that he wants, through this law, Israel to officially declare that its Jewish character is superior to its democratic charter. And this is incredibly popular. I expect that the law will eventually be passed, and the Supreme Court might overturn it out of fear for Israel's international image. Hanin Zouabi, who's a character I profile in this book at length, who's probably the most outspoken Palestinian member of Knesset. She's from the Balad Party, which is a party that it currently has 2 seats in the Knesset, and it's organized around the idea of Israel as a state of all its citizens. In other words, a state where everyone enjoys equal rights. So she has been singled out as disloyal because of the party platform. And she has been banned in the last 2 Knesset elections by the Central Elections Committee. This was overturned both times by the Supreme Court, and so Bennett's party, supported by other right-wing parties, including the governing Likud party, has introduced legislation to allow a veto of Supreme Court rulings. Not only that, there is a new law introduced this week, and every week there's a law like this, and this may pass, that will allow the Knesset to demand a 2/3 vote among the Israeli public in a referendum to initiate any negotiations with the Palestinian Authority on dividing Jerusalem or providing any part of it to them for a future Palestinian capital. So they're already doing everything they can to obstruct peace negotiations as the U.S. sends Kerry over there again and again and again on our dime. I mean, we're paying for that jet fuel to just burn up in the air for nothing. I want to get into the African situation, but I want to tell you about a legislator who I met who is a really remarkable character, who is the sponsor of many of these laws. He's a tireless worker for the agenda that he believes in. He's incredibly forthright. He gets up in the morning at 6 a.m. and he's in his office for 12 hours, fielding calls from his constituents, doing what they want. He believes deeply in a certain vision of democracy. His name is David Rotem. David Rotem, many of you may not have heard of him, but he's a top deputy of Avigdor Lieberman in the Israel Beitenu party, and he's the chair of the Constitution Committee in the Knesset, which is a very important committee because Israel has no constitution, so they kind of make it up as they go along. There are many reasons why Israel has no constitution. One reason is that a constitution requires you to set national borders, and Israel has never set national borders according to any internationally recognized agreement. It has no borders. So whenever any pro-Israel partisan asks if, why do I want to wipe Israel off the map or whatever, I'll ask them, can you draw it on a map for me? Because I don't know where it is. I don't know where Palestine is either. No one knows where these things are right now. So anyway, Rotem is at the chair of this committee, banging the gavel, intimidating liberal members of the committee, ramming through laws. And I met him at his home in the settlement of Efrat, which is like a mega settlement filled with many American immigrants to Israel. He was very welcoming to me, and we kind of argued or sparred over his ideas. First, I asked him, would you ever, in any future situation, agree to live next door to an Arab? And he said that his home had actually been built by Palestinian workers, and he caught one of them writing his name on the wall. And he said, why are you writing your name on the wall? And he said, I'm putting it here because one day this will be my house after a withdrawal. And so he said, I don't trust them, and I would never allow one of them to live next door to me. I'm determined to prevent this situation. And then he said, I'm also determined to prevent a second Holocaust. His inspiration, he said, were the Jews who were sent away on cattle cars and wrote on the walls of the cattle cars, take revenge, and that he was taking revenge. And I said, yeah, it's kind of strange you're taking revenge on people who weren't responsible for the Holocaust. Why do you keep talking about the Holocaust throughout this conversation? It's over. And he said, I said that most of the Nazis are dead, and he said, I have a chip on my shoulder and a tick in my brain, and it's called the Holocaust. And this is very typical for his society. And finally, I challenged him, and I said, a lot of these laws that you're passing remind me of what Thomas Jefferson would have described as the tyranny of the majority. And he looked at me in a very forthright way. He said, the tyranny of the majority is the essence of democracy. And that's how it's understood, not just by Rotem or by extremists, but increasingly by the mainstream of Israeli society as it's challenged by Palestinians and by those who are asking for a state of all its citizens, which would technically strip away what many Israelis understand as the Jewish character of the state. So finally, there was the Anti-Infiltration Act. You heard the language in this documentary of infiltrators. What is an infiltrator? Well, the term was first introduced after the establishment of the State of Israel, when 750,000 indigenous Palestinians were expelled or forced out of their homes and away from their property. And many tried to return in the early 50s. You can read about this in the Benny Morris book, Israel's Border Wars, about the attempts to basically consolidate the Jewish state by keeping these people out. 90% of them were trying to return not because they were fedayeen or trying to stage terror attacks, but because they were trying to reunite with their family, reunite with their property. They were fearing that their fields would fall fallow, and they actually wanted to till their fields. So Israel passed a law in 1954 called the Anti-Infiltration Act, which defined anyone who left their homes between the time of the UN partition plan and the establishment of the State of Israel as an infiltrator whose presence was illegal inside the territory claimed by the Jewish state, authorizing the border police then to basically rip them out of their homes and either send them on these harrowing marches, which I describe in my book, or just simply dump them in a refugee camp. This law has been updated and amended to apply to non-Jewish Africans who, as you heard, number about 60,000, have been denied work permits and are mainly concentrated in the area of South Tel Aviv, which is probably the poorest area of the city, in an area that it's been traditionally under the control of the right wing, which is used to kind of racial backlash rhetoric to divide people who share class interests, like the people you saw in that video who are Jews of Arab descent and share many class interests with Palestinians and even with Africans. So this law has allowed, and you have to see this law as part of the kind of seamless continuation of expulsion from 1948 to the present, now applying to a new group. That new group consists of people who are sleeping by the thousands in the Saharonim desert camp. I've been criticized for the title of a chapter I wrote about this desert camp. I titled it The Concentration Camp. And that's because former Speaker of Knesset, Reuven Rivlin, of the Likud party, actually said it's not really right and proper of us as a Jewish state to have a concentration camp in the desert. Those were his words, along with the Israeli architectural collective Bikrom, which called it a concentration camp with harsh conditions. And this was actually a camp that was originally the Ketziot prison, which housed Palestinian political prisoners during the first Intifada. To read about that, learn about that camp, read the book Prisoners by Jeffrey Goldberg, who is a former prison guard at the camp who has confessed to abusing Palestinian prisoners. Of course, he said, I didn't do it until they hit me first. He is now the chief columnist for Bloomberg on this issue, for Bloomberg News, and someone who, according to Politico, spars intellectually with Barack Obama inside the White House, along with Thomas Friedman and some really fine minds. So this camp has been challenged by a group of liberal Israelis who filed an appeal about the amendment to the Infiltration Act. Not the Infiltration Act itself, that's never been challenged. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. It ruled that Israel would have to either pass new laws or release these people back into the streets. I was just there in September. There were large anti-migrant rallies demanding that the state do something to keep them inside the camp. It became a big issue in the municipal elections, which were just carried out. And the young woman you saw at the beginning of this video, whose name is May Golan, was just appointed to a steering committee by the new Interior Minister, Gideon Sa'ar, in charge of migrant policy in Tel Aviv. And she's basically an anti-African activist who's, 25. She looks like she could be keeping up with the Kardashians. And she's declared she's proud to be a racist. So she's really going places inside Israeli politics right now, and it's because of this new decision. So Netanyahu has proposed an alternative plan, which is that the non-Jewish Africans would be allowed to go out in the day and conduct their business, but ultimately they had to be sequestered from Jewish Israeli society because they threaten the Jewish character. They can't be allowed to mingle in with the public and possibly assimilate through marriage or, having kids, forming relationships. So he's planned to build a new camp where they could just sleep for 1.5 years until he can find means of deporting them. In this country, during the Jim Crow era, not just in the South, we had what was known as sundown towns. The historian James Lowen writes about these towns and exposed the fact that even Chevy Chase, Maryland, in suburban DC, was a sundown town for a few years. This meant that African Americans who were caught in these towns after dark would basically be jailed or sent away by the local police. So what Netanyahu has proposed to do as an alternative solution is turn Israel into the largest sundown town in the world, of course with full support from the government of the United States and its first African-American president. Few of you have heard about this proposal, but it's pretty widely known inside Israel and in the Israeli press. This is part of a general policy of expulsion and the term is used, concentration, in official literature and rhetoric that's occurring in the Negev desert and inside the Green Line in Israel. I haven't left the Green Line in this talk. I'm not going to, although I write extensively about the Palestinian situation in the West Bank. We're talking about the area of Israel that would be legitimized under a two-state solution. So right near where the Saharonim camp is in the Negev desert, there are 80,000 indigenous Bedouin who live in unrecognized communities. These are Israeli citizens, including many who've served in the Israeli army. So what is an unrecognized community? An unrecognized community means that the state doesn't provide them with any public services. So they live mostly, or many of them live right under electricity wires, but they can't hook up to the electricity grid. They can't get public health clinics. They can't get public schools in their community. And all of the buildings that they've built, every home, all of their construction is technically illegal. They can't get permits to build anything. And it's simply because they're not Jewish, even though they're Israeli citizens. So there has been an effort to remove the Bedouins from these unrecognized communities and in their place build small Jewish-only communities authorized by the Acceptance to Communities Act that I built. I visited one of them in 2010. You can read about it in Goliath. It was called Al Arakib. I went down there with a group of really brave Jewish Israeli activists who I also profile in this book, who are very marginalized, but they're very active and they're completely fearless people. They're some of the best activists I've met anywhere in the world, and it's really unfortunate that they've been so marginalized and repressed. And we met in a parking lot in Jerusalem and took a small bus down a highway into the Negev desert, and we arrived at about 2 a.m. in this Bedouin village, Al Arakib. We drove past a sign that said, soon to be the future site of God TV Forest. which I found out what that is later. I'll tell you what that is later. And some of the villagers put out mats for us. They poured us coffee, and we hung out for a while, and then we fell asleep. And I woke up to the rumble of bulldozers and a riot squad moving in, this phalanx of black masked officers, removing everyone from their homes. The village was destroyed and wiped off the map before my eyes. This was the third destruction of Al-Araqib. It has been destroyed 51 times since that day. It should hold the Guinness Book of World Records record for for destruction or demolitions. And these are just a few of the structures that Israel's destroyed over its history. Since 1967, Israel has destroyed 26,000 Palestinian homes and uprooted 800,000 olive trees. Just last week, settlers uprooted 600 olive trees near Nablus. It's olive season, which means it's vandalism season. That's enough olive trees to fill 33 central parks. So after witnessing this village be wiped off the map, I realized that there was a coherent policy in the works, that there was a blueprint, and this was of a part with the blueprint. First of all, in this specific community, there was a plan by the Jewish National Fund, which has a division in the United States that raises tens of millions of dollars. Bill Clinton has given speeches for this group, fundraising speeches, and been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so. And it's linked to the Israeli government. It leases land from the Israeli government, and it says that it's in its charter that the goal is to provide the land to the Jewish people, meaning that anyone who lives on the land has to be Jewish. So there's establishing Jews-only communities, and they plan to build a forest on top of Al-Araqib in the desert, a pine forest in the desert, which is sort of consistent with this vision of Europeanizing Palestine and de-orientalizing, de-Levantonizing the area. And the forest is going to be paid for partly by God TV, which is an apocalyptic end times network based in the UK, headed by the conspiracist Rory Alec, which has a broadcast center in Jerusalem, which promotes anti-Arab Islamophobic propaganda 24/7. I visited their studios. My videos, I actually tried to show one of the technicians my video of the village being destroyed, but I couldn't. There was a filter on the TV, on the computers, like Ned Flanders' kids have everything filtered, so I couldn't show it to him. But so the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, is partnering with these Christian Zionists to conduct ethnic cleansing in the Negev desert. And now we've seen the plan. The plan has been introduced. It's out in the open. It's called the Prawer Plan, P-R-A-W-E-R, named after Benjamin Netanyahu's policy planning chief, Ehud Prawer. And it will remove 30 to 40,000 indigenous Bedouin from unrecognized communities and put them in special towns which are not unlike Indian reservations. Towns like Rahat, which are closely controlled, carefully controlled and deliberately constructed by the State of Israel and a government-linked group called the Or Movement, according to the Or Movement's website, to quote-unquote concentrate the Bedouin population, to remove them from their land and allow the Jewish people access to it through the JNF. This will be the largest coherent project of ethnic cleansing since 1948, and it's been scarcely reported in our media. There's very little activism around it, and it's a human rights atrocity that really needs to be opposed. So I wanted to tell you about it. Now, why are these Bedouins such a threat? They're Israeli citizens. They're not engaging in terrorism against Israel. They're not a security threat. No one even claims they're a security threat. However, high school students in Kiryat Gat have been warned that they should not form relationships with the Bedouins because they are indeed a threat. They're a threat to the Jewish character of the state because they have dated religious Jewish women, and they're shown films warning them about the dangers of assimilation in Kiryat Gat, which is a working class community near the Negev desert. Hundreds of Israeli state rabbis you saw in this letter here. And this is just one threat I'm going to discuss that the Bedouins pose to the Jewish state. You saw this letter of state-appointed Israeli rabbis who have forbidden, under this rabbinical edict, kind of extrapolating out of Jewish law and abusing the Torah, forbidding renting to non-Jews. But their wives issued a separate letter almost the same week, warning Jewish women not to date Arab men, warning that it was illegal under Jewish law and that there would be harsh punishments. And this letter gave rise to the anti-miscegenation movement, a burgeoning anti-miscegenation movement, which I write about in my book. There is a group called Lehava, which is run and operated and founded by compatriots of Michael Ben-Ari, former Kahanists, who are gaining a lot of influence, a frightening amount of influence. They have an anti-miscegenation Coast Guard where they march up and down beaches warning Jewish women not to talk to Arab men. They have put flyers around Jerusalem warning Arab men not to talk to Jewish women. They warn that they'll face harsh consequences. They've posted photographs of Arab men seen dating religious Jewish women. They have even set up a hotline recently, allowing people to inform on interreligious and interethnic couples. A week ago, actually it was 2 weeks ago, the National Civil Service Administration of Israel officially banned religious Jewish women from volunteering in hospitals after 9 p.m. out of fear that they would date Arab doctors under pressure from Lahava and its Kahanist director, Benzi Gopstein. And this decision was endorsed by Economics Minister Naftali Bennett. Now, I come from, the American Jewish world in which, your parents, if you're, they want you to date a doctor. So I don't really get this decision. And Lahava has a sister organization called Hemla, or Mercy, which runs a home for Jewish women who have supposedly run away from relationships with Arabs. This home is funded, half of its funds come from the state. They come from the state of Israel. So this is a state-funded movement. There's also Yad Le'achim, which is a group that claims to stage commando-style raids into Arab villages to release Jewish women from Arab captivity, and they claim to work with the Israeli army on these raids. Finally, there's a book, I read about a book called Torat HaMelech, which was published by many of the rabbis who signed these letters. And I went to a conference in Jerusalem. I went to the Jerusalem Ramada Hotel, to this really tacky hotel with like fake plants and track lighting and like mirror balls everywhere. And there were major religious nationalist figures on stage, including Dov Lior, who is the chief rabbi of Kiryat Arba, the extremist settlement in Hebron, a man who had declared assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a din rodef, or a traitor to the Jewish people, a man who had declared Rabin a din moser, or a snitch on the Jewish people, who has called for live human experimentation on Palestinian prisoners and warned that the Kushim, or the Negroes, are bringing the evils of boogie-woogie music into our world. And he was on stage along with Chaim Druckman, a major settler rabbi, and figure after figure to defend this book, Torat HaMelech, which is published by 2 settler rabbis, funded by the state, which according to the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv is a guide for when it is permissible to kill non-Jews. One of the instructions in this book, one of its lowlights, is that it is permissible to kill children in a time of war if it is deemed that they will grow up to harm us. And according to Dov Lior, Israel's been in a time of war since its foundation. Israel's actually been in a state of emergency since its foundation. And when the Israeli Supreme Court reauthorized the state of emergency, Supreme Court Justice Eliakim Rubinstein justified it on the basis that Israel is a normal country that is not normal. That's the epigraph to my book. This book, Torat HaMelech, has sold more copies in Israel than Peter Beinart's The Crisis of Zionism sold in the United States. And hopefully I'll, with your help, outsell these authors. Its authors were called into interrogations by the Shin Bet extremist unit, a unit that's interrogated many of my friends who are left-wing anti-occupation activists and who have no choice but to submit themselves to these interrogations when they're called. And they didn't go. They just simply refused, and nothing happened to them. Not only that, but their followers tried to storm the Supreme Court by the hundreds, and the state prosecutor, who is a member of the Likud party, appointed by Netanyahu, had to go into hiding out of fear of their followers. So you see the right retreating from the far right. You see this constantly when you're inside the Green Line. You've this feeling among the liberal Israeli public that the settlers have not only consolidated their dominance in the West Bank, but they're moving back across the Green Line through this campaign they call Settling in the Hearts. Where I lived in Jaffa, the Palestinian ghetto of Tel Aviv, where the remnants of those expelled in 1948 live, where there are 500 standing eviction orders and a massive campaign of gentrification to remove them, a group of settlers have founded a yeshiva in the heart of the Palestinian neighborhood, in the heart of Ajami, a settler yeshiva, and they've staged settler riots. They firebombed my favorite fish restaurant. They've vandalized a Muslim graveyard, and there is now a campaign to ban the call of the muezzin in Jaffa, in this historic Palestinian city. This is part of what Oren Yiftehel, the Israeli sociologist and geographer, political geographer, calls vertical apartheid. He distinguishes it from horizontal apartheid, which is the expansion of a settler colonial project into the West Bank, and talks about how the new plan, since all of the settlements have basically been built out, is to build up, and build up including in places like Tel Aviv. The African situation is perfect evidence of that in South Tel Aviv, where you see Israeli leftists chaperoning African children to school to prevent them from being attacked, not only by people from that neighborhood, but by settlers who come in from Hebron, like Michael Ben Ari and his followers, the people you saw at the end of that video. This was a tactic that was originally employed by activists in Hebron against those settlers. And so something David Sheen said to me really sticks with me, which is that at this point in Israel, there's no sanctuary anymore. In other words, the liberal democratic bubble that we had even in Tel Aviv in our little neighborhoods is rapidly evaporating. And we see the established left-wing and liberal Zionist parties responding in kind by turning inwards, by turning towards what they consider to be domestic issues, like the price of food, like the national insurance system. We saw that evidenced in the 2011 tent protest, which was Israel's version of Occupy, when hundreds of thousands of young Israelis, really representing the liberal left of the political spectrum, came out to protest against neoliberalism and protest against hypercapitalism without mentioning at all, deliberately ignoring the Palestinian situation. And they were able to do that because of the separation. So they have released Netanyahu from any kind of pressure that he might have felt in the past. And Netanyahu is occupying the hollow center in Israeli politics. Someone who was considered an extremist 20 years ago in 1989 when he went to Bar Ilan University and declared that a big mistake of the Likud government at the time, which he was in as one of its young Turks, was the failure to carry out mass expulsions in the occupied territories while the world was focused on the protests in Tiananmen Square. Now Netanyahu is trying to hold off the young Turks in his own party who want to annex most of the West Bank, the 60% of the West Bank known as Area C, and do away forever with the idea, which is at this point just an illusion, of a Palestinian state, and bring apartheid into the open. They include people like Naftali Bennett, who I mentioned before, but they also include people in Netanyahu's own party, like Danny Danon, who you saw in this video. The deputy defense minister favors these policies and has written in the New York Times in favor of a single apartheid state from the river to the sea. Sipi Hotavelli, who's like the Sarah Palin of Israel, is 34 years old. She's very telegenic. She speaks very good English and is great, in TV interviews. She speaks better English than Sarah Palin does. She held in the last Knesset hearings on the dangers of assimilation or Arab-Jewish dating and brought the leadership of Lahava to testify in the Knesset. She favors annexing the majority of the West Bank. She told me so herself. She told me, I agree with Naftali Bennett, the Palestinians should be given Jordanian residency, and that's it. And she is the deputy transportation minister, a stepping stone to higher office. And again, she's even younger than I am. There is Zev Elkin. You haven't heard of him, which is interesting because he is currently the top diplomat of the State of Israel. Avigdor Lieberman, who was the foreign minister, has been temporarily removed because he's going on trial for his mafia ties, which I write about at the beginning of the book. And Elkin has replaced him, another immigrant from Moscow, he's from the Ukraine, who also favors annexing the West Bank. Lieberman doesn't even favor annexing the West Bank, by the way. He favors something that resembles much more closely the U.S. Project for a Palestinian Bantustan state, which he calls cantons. And so the acting foreign minister of Israel, Zev Elkin, favors annexing the West Bank, and I interviewed him in my book. I interviewed him about a law he was trying to pass, which would have criminalized any form of speech calling for boycotts of settlement products inside Israel. And the law passed in diluted form. He couldn't speak English to me. Now, of course, I don't demand that anyone speaks English to me inside Israel. It's their right, and I had David Sheen there to make sure that the Hebrew was right. That's not the problem. The problem is that if you're going to be the foreign minister and your strategic deterrence is completely contingent on your direct line to Washington, where people, most people, I don't know, when Bush was president, it might have been different, but people speak English. And so this is a big problem for the state of Israel. It's a huge problem when you consider that they have no end game. They really have no way to resolve the situation that they've placed themselves in with the Palestinians. The current strategy is what Netanyahu defines as peace without peace. And that means that as long as Israel can hold on to a one-way peace where most of its citizens are happy, they'll continue to maintain the occupation with no end game and try to buy time by, for example, mowing the lawn, which is code for occasional bombings of the Gaza Strip to keep the population suppressed. Can this last? Can the status quo be sustained? Well, even Hillary Clinton has said the status quo is unsustainable, but it is sustainable as long as the United States continues to support it and fund it to the tune of $30 billion every 10 years. That's your money. This is our project as much as Israel's. And so whatever you think about the conclusions that I've come to, and I'm happy to come to all the, my conclusions and prescriptions in Q&A, but whatever you think about that, you have to conclude that the status quo can't be allowed to continue, and it has to be upended. And we have to start thinking of ways to challenge it and look past this bloody impasse. Until then, almost all of the state of Israel, with no borders, under a regime of ethnic separation, will be surrounded with walls and fortifications. The entire Gaza Strip is surrounded by walls and electrical fencing. The separation wall runs from 600 miles to the north, from north to the south of the West Bank, cutting into the West Bank, as I said. Netanyahu has authorized $360 million to build a wall along the Jordanian border. He has taken $200 million out of the Israeli social budget to build a wall along the border of the Sinai to keep African migrants out. The border with Syria, which is actually an occupied frontier in the Golan Strip, is completely mined. The border with Lebanon has been reinforced with new fences. And Arnon Sofer, the top demographer in Israel, an advisor to Netanyahu and previous governments, has called for seawalls to keep climate change refugees out, because, as he said, we are not of this region. So until the status quo is upended, the prophecy in the book of Numbers will continue to be fulfilled, that the people of Israel will dwell alone and not be reckoned among the nations.